The hum of Christmas laughter leaked through my daughter's dining room as her husband called me "old man" and suggested an Uber like I didn't belong there anymore. As I set my napkin down with careful hands, I kept my voice calm, choosing restraint over the shame burning in my chest. While the clink of silverware carried on, that sound grew heavier, counting every year I'd swallowed disrespect to keep my family together. The same hollow noise followed my thoughts to all the times I stayed quiet, so my daughter wouldn't have to choose sides. That's when I realized silence hadn't protected my family. It had taught her husband I was safe to erase. Still, I stood knowing this Christmas would be the last time I left my dignity at my daughter's table. Before the story begins, tell me, where are you watching from? I hope your day's gentle and calm. Please like, subscribe, and let's start our story together. Hank parked a block away from his daughter's house, not because there wasn't space in the driveway, but because he needed a moment to steady himself. Christmas lights glowed softly along the rooftops, plastic reindeer frozen mid-prance, wreaths hung with careful symmetry. From the outside, everything looked warm, orderly, safe. He sat in the car a few seconds longer than necessary, hands resting on the steering wheel, reminding himself why he was there. It was Christmas. He was a father. Tonight was supposed to be peaceful. When he finally stepped inside, the smell of roasted turkey and cinnamon hit him first. Laughter drifted from the living room. For a brief second, Hank allowed himself to believe the night might go differently. That belief didn't survive the front door closing behind him. Brian was the first to greet him. He leaned casually against the hallway wall, wine glass in hand, lips curled into a smile that never reached his eyes. "Wow," Brian said, looking Hank up and down, lingering just long enough to make it uncomfortable. "You made it out after dark. That's impressive." Hank forced a polite nod. "Merry Christmas, Brian." Brian chuckled as if the greeting itself were amusing. "Did you drive yourself, or is that still allowed?" The comment landed softly but carried weight. Hank felt it settle in his chest. He didn't respond, instead stepping past him, scanning the room for Maggie and Hannah. He spotted his daughter near the tree, adjusting an ornament, her face lighting up briefly when she saw him. That small moment of relief was enough to keep him grounded. Dinner was loud in the way family gatherings always were, but beneath the chatter ran a thin current of tension Hank couldn't ignore. Every time he spoke, Brian found a way to interrupt or redirect the conversation. When Hank mentioned finally enjoying retirement, Brian laughed openly. "Retirement," Brian repeated, shaking his head. "Must be nice having nothing to contribute anymore." Hank's fork paused midair. He swallowed before responding. "I contributed plenty, still do in my own way." Brian raised an eyebrow. "Sure you do." Maggie jumped in quickly, her voice tight with forced cheer. "Brian, please, let's just enjoy dinner." She reached for Hank's hand under the table, a quiet apology in the gesture, but the damage was already done. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. As the meal went on, Hank found himself retreating inward. He'd been here before countless times. The sideways comments, the jokes that weren't jokes, the way Brian spoke to him like he was something outdated, an inconvenience tolerated for Hannah's sake. Hank had told himself for years to ignore it, to be the bigger man, to keep the peace for his daughter. But peace, he was realizing, came at a cost. Brian leaned back in his chair, stretching his arms. "You know," he said loudly, "it's probably safer if Hank doesn't drive home tonight. Reaction times aren't what they used to be." A few people laughed awkwardly. Hannah stared down at her plate. Maggie's face flushed. Hank felt heat rise behind his eyes, not anger yet, but something colder, a deep, aching humiliation. Maggie tried again to smooth things over. "Brian, that's enough. You're being rude." Brian shrugged. "I'm just being honest." Hank set his napkin down carefully. He could hear his own heartbeat. Memories surfaced uninvited, holidays where Brian ignored him completely, birthdays where his opinions were dismissed, moments when he'd felt like a guest instead of family. He had carried those moments quietly, stacking them one on top of another, telling himself they didn't matter. Tonight, they mattered. Then Brian smiled, sharp and deliberate. "Hey, when you're ready to head out," he said, lifting his glass, "just call an Uber, old man. No need to risk it." The words hit harder than Hank expected. The table went silent. Hank looked around, waiting for anyone to say something. No one did. Hannah's eyes flickered toward him, then away. Hank stood slowly, every movement controlled. "Excuse me," he said, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. He walked toward the hallway, his coat still hanging where he'd left it. As he slipped his arms into the sleeves, his hands trembled slightly. Not from fear, from clarity. Something had shifted. The line Brian had crossed wasn't just about disrespect, it was about dignity. Hank glanced back toward the dining room, listening to the muffled sounds of conversation resuming without him. He stepped outside into the cold night, breathing deeply. This wouldn't be ignored, not anymore. And as Hank walked toward his car, a quiet decision took shape, one that would make Brian finally understand there were consequences to treating someone like they didn't matter. Hank didn't drive home right away. He sat in his car with the engine off, the house still visible in his rearview mirror, glowing with Christmas lights like nothing inside it was broken. His hands rested in his. Lap stiff, useless. Brian's voice replayed in his head, not just tonight's words but years of them. Layered insults disguised as jokes, dismissals wrapped in smiles. He remembered the first time he tried to bond with Brian. It had been years ago, shortly after the wedding. Hank had invited him fishing, just the two of them, thinking time on the water might help. Brian had checked his phone the whole time, left early, muttering something about real work waiting. Another time, Hank had offered advice about home repairs, only to be told, "I've got professionals for that." Each attempt ended the same way, polite rejection at best, open contempt at worst. What hurt more than Brian's behavior was Hannah's silence. Hank stared at the house and wondered when exactly his place in her life had shifted. Had he slowly been pushed to the margins without noticing? He thought of her eyes at the dinner table, how they dropped when Brian spoke, how she didn't meet Hank's gaze. It felt less like neutrality and more like surrender. Eventually, Hank forced himself back inside. The noise of conversation washed over him again, louder now, looser with wine. Brian was mid-story, holding court. When Hank re-entered the room, Brian glanced at him and smirked. "Thought you left," Brian said. "Or did you forget where you parked?" A few people laughed again, uneasy but complicit. Hank felt something tighten in his chest. Maggie immediately stood, her chair scraping the floor. "Brian, stop it," she said sharply. "Enough, it's Christmas." Brian lifted his hands in mock surrender. "What? I'm just saying he's sensitive tonight." Hank opened his mouth, then closed it. He realized with sudden clarity that nothing he said would matter. Brian didn't want resolution. He wanted dominance. And the longer Hank stayed silent, the more permission Brian seemed to take. Maggie moved closer to Hank, lowering her voice. "Please," she whispered, "let's not make this worse." But Brian wasn't done. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, eyes locked on Hank. "You know, Hank, maybe it's time you accept things have changed. This is our family now. You're visiting." The word cut deeper than any insult. Visiting, as if Hank were temporary, optional. Hank felt the room tilt. His heart pounded, not with rage yet, but with something heavier, finality. He looked at Maggie, saw the fear there, the exhaustion. He looked at Hannah, saw conflict she wasn't ready to face. And he understood then that if he didn't draw a line, no one else would. He stepped into the hallway, pulled his phone from his pocket, and stared at the contact name for a long moment. Jack Holden, sheriff, old friend, someone who still treated him like he mattered. Jack answered on the second ring. "Hank, everything okay?" Hank lowered his voice. "I need advice," he said, "not as a friend, as a sheriff." There was a pause. "That bad?" "Yes." Hank didn't explain everything. He didn't need to. Jack listened, asked a few direct questions, then said quietly, "We should talk tomorrow, in person." Hank felt a strange calm settle over him. "I'd appreciate that." When he returned to the dining room, Brian was already watching him. "Everything all right?" Brian asked, tone dripping with false concern. "Or do you need a ride home?" The night dragged on, each minute heavier than the last. Brian kept at it, smaller jabs now but relentless. Finally, as coats were being gathered, Brian clapped Hank lightly on the shoulder. "Seriously," he said, smiling, "you should probably head home and stay out of our way, less stress for everyone." Hank met his eyes. For the first time, he didn't look away. "Don't worry," Hank said calmly, "I will." But as he stepped into the cold again, his decision was already made. This wouldn't end with silence or swallowed pride. Brian had mistaken patience for weakness. And tomorrow, Hank would take the first step toward making him understand the difference. Hank barely slept. The house was quiet in the way it only got after midnight, when even the old pipes seemed to hold their breath. He lay awake replaying every word, every look from the night before, until the weight of it pressed against his chest. Just after dawn, while the sky was still a dull gray, he reached for his phone and dialed the number he hadn't needed to use in years. Jack Holden answered with the steady voice Hank remembered. "Morning, Hank." "I need to see you," Hank said, "today." There was no hesitation. "Meet me at the diner on Main, 8 o'clock. The diner smelled like burnt coffee and disinfectant, a familiar comfort. Jack was already there, uniform jacket draped over the back of the booth, coffee untouched. He looked older than Hank remembered, lines carved deeper around his eyes, but the same calm authority sat in his posture. They didn't waste time on small talk. Hank wrapped his hands around his mug and began talking, words spilling out more easily than he expected. He told Jack about the years of Slig. The jokes that cut just enough to bleed, the way Brian spoke to him like he was already irrelevant. He described the look on Hannah's face at the table, the silence that felt like betrayal. His voice tightened when he repeated the words Brian had used, calling Huber old man. Jack listened without interrupting, his expression hardening with every detail. When Hank finished, he leaned back slightly. "You've been patient," Jack said, "too patient." Hank let out a slow breath. "I kept telling myself it wasn't worth the fight, that family mattered more." "And now?" Jack asked. "Now I feel like I don't matter at all." Jack nodded. "You do have options," he said carefully. "But I need to be clear, any formal action you take is going to change things, permanently." Hank already knew that. He thought of Maggie, how tired she'd looked trying to keep the peace. He thought of Hannah, caught between loyalty and fear. The idea of pushing them further away made his chest ache. "What happens to my family if I do this?" Hank asked quietly. Jack didn't sugarcoat it. "Your wife and daughter might see it as an attack, at least at first. They may not understand why you're doing it. Brian will play the victim. There will be fallout." Hank stared down at the table, tracing the worn edge with his thumb. He thought about all the times he'd swallowed his pride to avoid exactly that kind of fallout. About how it had only taught Brian that there were no consequences. "I keep wondering," Hank said, "if standing up now fixes anything, or if it just breaks what's left." Jack leaned forward. "Let me tell you something," he said. "I've seen a lot of families tear themselves apart trying to avoid conflict. Silence doesn't protect relationships, it just hides the damage." Hank looked up. "You really think this is the only way?" "I think," Jack said evenly, "that sometimes taking a stand is the only way to be heard. Respect doesn't come from endurance, it comes from boundaries." The words settled in Hank's chest, heavy but solid. He realized then that his fear wasn't just about losing his family. It was about finally admitting how small Brian had made him feel. They talked through the practical details next, the legal framework, the steps that would need to be taken. Jack was careful, professional, but his support was unmistakable. By the time Hank stood to leave, his hands were steady. Outside, the cold air bit at his face, sharp and clarifying. Hank sat in his car for a moment, looking at the diner's fogged windows. He thought of Maggie's voice asking him not to make things worse. He thought of Hannah's silence. This choice could cost him everything, or it could be the first honest thing he'd done in years. Hank started the engine, a quiet resolve settling over him. Whatever happened next, Brian would finally understand that treating someone like they didn't matter had consequences, and Hank was ready to see it through. Hank woke before dawn, the house still wrapped in silence. Christmas morning used to mean excitement, whispered plans, coffee brewing early. Now it felt different, heavier, deliberate. He sat at the kitchen table with the papers spread neatly in front of him, reading through them one last time. Every line felt final. His name, Brian's name, the address. Black ink on white paper, cold and exact. This wasn't anger anymore. It was resolve. He folded the documents carefully and slipped them into a manila envelope. His hands didn't shake, which surprised him. What he felt wasn't relief exactly, but clarity. For years, he'd bent himself smaller to avoid moments like this. He thought of every holiday where he'd smiled through disrespect, every conversation where he'd backed down so others wouldn't be uncomfortable. Respect, he realized, wasn't something you were given for being patient. It was something you demanded by refusing to be erased. Jack was waiting outside when Hank pulled up. The sheriff's cruiser idled quietly, lights off, but its presence alone made the moment real. Jack stepped out, adjusting his coat, his expression calm but serious. "You sure about this?" Jack asked. Hank nodded. "I've never been more sure of anything." They drove in silence through streets still empty from the holiday. Snow clung to the curbs untouched. As Brian's house came into view, Hank's chest tightened. This was his daughter's home too. The place where he'd brought gifts, watched laughter spill through open windows, pretended things were fine. Now it stood like a boundary he was about to cross. They parked. Hank stayed seated a second longer, breathing slowly. "I never wanted it to come to this," he said quietly. Jack looked at him. "Standing up for yourself doesn't make you the villain." They walked up the path together. Each step felt louder than the last. Hank's pulse thudded in his ears as Jack knocked. There was movement inside, then the door swung open. Brian stood there in sweatpants, irritation already on his face. "You've got to be kidding me," he said, eyes locking on Hank. "It's Christmas. What do you want now?" Then he noticed Jack, the badge, the uniform. Brian's smirk faltered. "What's this?" he asked, tone shifting. Hank met his gaze, steady and calm. "This is where things change." Brian scoffed, trying to recover. "Did you call the cops on me? Seriously?" Jack stepped forward, professional, controlled. "Brian Davis." Brian's jaw tightened. "Yeah. I'm here to serve you legal notice." The words hung in the cold air. Hank extended the envelope. "You've crossed the line," he said simply, "and now you'll understand the consequences." Brian stared at the papers like they were written in another language. "This is a joke," he said, but there was no conviction in it. "You don't have the guts for this." Jack spoke evenly. "These documents state that you are being formally notified of eviction proceedings from this property." Brian's face drained of color. "Eviction?" he snapped, eyes flying back to Hank. "You can't do this." "I can," Hank said, "and I am." Brian's mouth opened, then closed. For the first time he had nothing ready. No joke, no insult, just disbelief. "This is my house," he said weakly. "It's not," Jack replied, "and you'll want to read the paperwork carefully." Silence stretched between them. Brian's hands shook as he took the envelope. His eyes burned with anger now, sharp and uncontained. "You think this makes you powerful," he said to Hank. "You think you've won something." Hank felt the weight of the moment press down on him, but he didn't look away. "I think you finally heard me." Jack cleared his throat. "You have legal options, Mr. Davis. Those are outlined inside." Brian said nothing. The door behind him stood open, warmth spilling out, a Christmas tree visible in the corner. Hank wondered who else inside was listening, who else would feel the shockwaves of this moment. As they turned back toward the car, Hank didn't feel triumph. He felt finality. Whatever came next, anger, fallout, broken relationships, there was no turning back now. And behind them, Brian stood frozen in the doorway, staring at the papers in his hands, realizing too late that Christmas morning had just become the day everything began to unravel. Brian exploded the moment the door closed behind Jack and Hank. His voice carried down the driveway, sharp and unrestrained. "You think this is over?" he shouted, waving the envelope like a weapon. "I'll bury you in court. I'll make sure you regret this." Hank stopped and turned back, meeting Brian's rage without flinching. "You're free to do whatever you think will fix this," he said evenly. "Threats won't." That only fueled Brian further. He stepped forward, face flushed, eyes wild. "You don't get to do this to me. Not you. You're nothing but a bitter old man who couldn't stand being irrelevant." Hank didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. He watched as Brian spun on his heel and stormed back inside, the door slamming hard enough to rattle the windows. The sound echoed in the quiet street, final and ugly. Hank exhaled slowly and walked to his car. Only once he was seated did his phone start to vibrate. Maggie's name lit up the screen. "What did you do?" she demanded the moment he answered. Her voice was tight, already breaking. "Hannah just called me. She's crying. Hank, what's going on?" He closed his eyes. "I served Brian legal notice this morning." There was a stunned silence. "On Christmas," Maggie whispered. "Yes." "You didn't even talk to me first," she said, hurt cutting through the anger. "Do you have any idea what this is doing to our daughter?" "I know exactly what it's doing," Hank said quietly. "And I know what doing nothing was doing too." Maggie's breath hitched. "You've torn the family apart." Hank swallowed. "It was already breaking. I just stopped pretending it was." The call ended without resolution, the line going dead in his ear. Hank sat there longer than necessary, staring through the windshield, letting the weight of it all press down. He didn't feel victorious. He felt hollow. Inside the house, voices rose again. Brian was shouting now, his words indistinct but venomous. Hank imagined Hannah standing there, caught in the blast radius, and the thought twisted in his chest. Still, he stayed where he was. Intervening now would only make things worse. When Maggie arrived an hour later, her face was drawn and pale. She didn't knock before coming inside the living room where Hank waited. "How could you?" she asked, tears spilling freely. "How could you do this without me?" Hank stood slowly. "I didn't want to hurt you." "Well, you did," she said, her voice breaking. "You hurt all of us." He nodded. "I know." They sat in silence for a long moment. Hank stared at his hands, thinking of every reason that had brought him here. The disrespect, the erosion of his place in his own family, the way Brian had looked at him like he was disposable. He still believed he'd done the right thing. That didn't make the cost any easier to bear. "I didn't wake up wanting this," Hank said finally. "I just couldn't keep letting him treat me like I didn't matter." Maggie wiped her eyes. There had to be another way. "Was there?" he asked gently. "Because I tried silence, I tried patience, I tried keeping the peace." She didn't answer. Her shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of her. "Hannah's devastated," she said. "She doesn't know who to stand by." "That's what scares me most," Hank admitted. Maggie reached for his hand, hesitant. "I understand why you did it," she said, "but understanding doesn't make it hurt less." "No," Hank said, "it doesn't." They sat together, both aware of the fracture running through their family now, wide and impossible to ignore. Maggie wanted to fix it, to pull everyone back together by sheer will. Hank knew that wasn't possible anymore. "I'm not backing down," he said quietly. "Not this time." Maggie looked at him, searching his face. "Then we have to accept that nothing will be the same." Outside, the house remained tense and quiet, as if holding its breath. Somewhere inside, Brian was plotting his next move, and Hank knew this fallout was only the beginning. Brian didn't bother knocking. The door burst open with a sharp crack, the sound echoing through the living room where Hank sat alone. Brian stormed in, face flushed, eyes burning with a mix of rage and disbelief. "You happy now?" he shouted. "You finally got what you wanted. You've destroyed this family." Hank stood slowly, keeping his hands at his sides. His heart pounded, but his voice stayed even. "I didn't destroy anything," he said. "I drew a line you kept crossing." Brian laughed, short and cruel. "That's rich. You call the sheriff on Christmas and pretend you're the victim." "I asked for respect," Hank replied. "For years you never gave it." Brian stepped closer, invading his space. "Respect is earned," he snapped, "not handed out because you're old." The word landed hard. Hank felt a flicker of anger rise, but he pushed it down. "I'm your wife's father," he said. "I'm part of this family, or at least I was supposed to be." Brian scoffed. "Family? You've been a guest from day one, hanging around, judging, acting like you still have authority." Maggie rushed in from the kitchen, drawn by the noise. "Brian, stop," she said, placing herself between them. "This isn't helping." Brian ignored her completely. "You think anyone cares what you want," he said to Hank. "You're retired, you're obsolete. This is what happens when you can't let go." Hank felt the words sink deep, stirring doubts he hadn't allowed himself to voice. Was this how everyone saw him now? An inconvenience clinging to relevance. "I didn't do this because I couldn't let go," Hank said quietly. "I did it because I was tired of being treated like I didn't exist." Brian's jaw tightened. "You overreacted. You always do, playing the wounded old man because you can't handle a joke." Maggie raised her voice. "Enough, Brian, you're being cruel." He turned on her. "Stay out of it," he snapped. "This is between me and him." Maggie's face fell, hurt flashing across it. Hank saw then how deeply Brian's control ran, how easily he dismissed anyone who challenged him. For the first time, Hank felt doubt creep in. He looked around the room, the home he'd once felt welcome in, and wondered if he'd misjudged everything. The cost of his stand was becoming painfully clear. Maggie's voice softened when she spoke again, this time to Hank. "I understand why you did it," she said, tears in her eyes. "I really do, but you blindsided me. You made a choice that affects all of us." Hank swallowed. "I didn't know how else to make it stop." "I feel betrayed," Maggie said quietly, "by both of you." The word cut deeper than Brian's insults. Hank turned away, fighting the tightness in his chest. He thought of Hannah, of how this confrontation would reach her, distort him further in her eyes. Each raised voice, each harsh word pushed her farther away. Brian laughed again, sharp and hollow. "See," he said, "you didn't just hurt me, you hurt her, you hurt everyone." Hank looked at him then, really looked. For the first time, Brian didn't seem powerful, just loud, desperate. "I'd do it again," Hank said, though the words felt heavy, "because letting this continue would have cost me myself." Brian shook his head. "Enjoy being alone," he said. "That's where this ends." He turned and walked out, slamming the door behind him. The house fell silent, the kind of silence that settles after something irreversible. Maggie sank onto the couch, covering her face. Hank stood there, unsure whether to follow Brian, comfort Maggie, or do nothing at all. One truth pressed in on him, unavoidable and terrifying. This confrontation might have been the moment he lost his daughter for good. And as he stood in the wreckage of his choice, Hank realized the hardest part wasn't standing up to Brian. It was living with what that stand might cost him next. Night settled heavily over the house, the kind of quiet that pressed in from all sides. Hank sat at the kitchen table long after the lights in the neighborhood had gone dark, the events of the day replaying in slow, relentless loops. He felt as though something had already been buried, even though no one had said the words out loud. A version of his family, loud, imperfect, but together, was gone, and he wasn't sure what would replace it. Maggie stayed. That alone mattered more than she probably realized. She moved through the house softly, like someone afraid of making noise in unfamiliar territory. When she finally sat across from him, there was distance in her posture, a carefulness that hadn't been there before. She was present but guarded, as if one wrong sentence might push her away. They ate a simple dinner without ceremony. No music, no television, just the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Hank watched Maggie push food around her plate, neither of them hungry, both of them aware that the silence between them was heavier than any argument. "I keep thinking," Maggie said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "that this might be it, that things will never be the same again." Hank nodded slowly. "I know." She looked up at him, eyes glassy. "I'm scared, Hank, scared that we've crossed a line we can't come back from." He wanted to reassure her, to promise that everything would settle, that Hannah would come around, that Brian would somehow change. But he didn't believe any of that. So he stayed quiet, the truth sitting between them. Later, Hank stood at the window staring out at the dark yard. Snow had started to fall, light and steady. It reminded him of Christmases years ago, Hannah running outside to catch flakes on her tongue, Maggie laughing from the porch, Brian not yet part of the picture. Back then, disagreements felt smaller, survivable. Back then, family meant something uncomplicated. He knew now that there was no returning to that version of life. The damage had been done, whether justified or not. Hank wondered, not for the first time, if he had the strength to see this through. Standing up had taken resolve. Living with the aftermath would take something deeper. He felt older tonight than he had in years, not because of his age, but because of the weight he was carrying. Maggie joined him at the window, wrapping her arms around herself. "I don't know how to fix this," she said softly. "I don't think we can," Hank replied. "Not the way it was." Tears slipped down her cheeks. "I hate that you're right." He turned to face her, seeing the pain he'd caused reflected there. "I never wanted to hurt you," he said. "Or Hannah." "I know," Maggie said. "That's what makes it so hard." They sat together on the couch after that, close but not touching, both staring ahead. Maggie broke first, her shoulders shaking as she cried. Hank pulled her into him, holding her as if anchoring her to something solid. He felt his own eyes burn, the grief finally breaking through his resolve. "We're going to carry this for a long time," Maggie said into his chest. "Yes," Hank agreed, "we are." They stayed that way until the tears slowed, until exhaustion dulled the edges of the pain. But even then, Hank couldn't shake the feeling that this quiet was temporary, that beneath it something was building. As he turned off the lights and headed for bed, Hank paused, listening to the house settle around him. The calm felt unnatural, fragile. And deep down, he knew the storm hadn't even begun. The first sign that Brian wasn't finished came quietly, almost innocently. Hank noticed it while drinking his morning coffee, scrolling through his phone without much thought. A familiar name popped up in the family group chat, Brian. Hank hesitated before opening it. His stomach tightened the moment he read the message. Brian hadn't written much. He hadn't needed to. He'd shared screenshots, carefully chosen and stripped of context, along with a few pointed lines about betrayal, manipulation, and an elderly man abusing the system to punish his own family. The message ended with a simple question: is this really who we trust? Within minutes, replies flooded in. Confusion, sympathy, outrage, some aimed at Brian but many too many at Hank. Maggie came into the kitchen, phone in hand, her face pale. "Have you seen this?" she asked. Hank nodded slowly. "I have now." Brian didn't stop there. By noon, the post had made its way to social media. Cousins Hank hadn't spoken to in years weighed in. Old friends asked cautious questions. The narrative was clear and deliberate. Brian was the victim. Hank was a bitter old man lashing out because he couldn't accept being sidelined. "This is revenge," Maggie said quietly, sinking into a chair. "He's trying to turn everyone against you." "And he's succeeding," Hank replied, his voice flat. For the first time, the full reality of Brian's anger set in. This wasn't just a family argument anymore. It was a public reckoning, and Brian had no intention of stopping until Hank was isolated. Maggie rubbed her temples, torn between outrage and fear. "I don't know how to stand by you without making this worse," she admitted. "Every time I defend you, he escalates." Hank felt a familiar ache settle in his chest. "You don't have to choose sides," he said, though the words tasted bitter. "I know how impossible this is." But the truth was, a choice was already being forced. Hank thought of Hannah, imagined her reading those messages, hearing Brian's version of events repeated by relatives she trusted. The thought that she might believe them, that she might see him as the villain, was almost unbearable. By evening, Hank's phone rang. Jack Holden's name flashed on the screen. "This is getting bigger," Jack said after Hank answered. "I wanted you to hear it from me." Hank leaned against the counter. "I figured." "Brian's been asking around," Jack continued, "talking about legal retaliation, making noise. None of it changes the facts, but it does complicate things." Hank closed his eyes. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying brace yourself," Jack replied. "There may be more fallout. He's not thinking rationally, and people like that don't stop when they feel cornered." After the call ended, the house felt smaller. Maggie sat across from Hank, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "Did we make a mistake?" she asked softly. Hank didn't answer right away. He thought of the look on Brian's face at the door, the years of silence he'd endured, the dignity he'd finally reclaimed. And then he thought of Hannah, drifting farther away with every new accusation. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I just know I couldn't keep living the way things were." That night Hank lay awake again, staring at the ceiling. The anger had faded, replaced by doubt and exhaustion. He'd wanted respect. What he had now was conflict on a scale he hadn't anticipated. And as messages continued to buzz unanswered on his phone, Hank began to wonder if standing up for himself had come at the cost of everything he was trying to protect. Hank read Emily's message for the third time without replying. Then a fourth. Each one sounded the same, apologies layered with confusion, love tangled with distance. "I'm sorry, Dad. I didn't know what to do. I never meant for it to go this far." The words should have eased something inside him. Instead, they reopened wounds he hadn't let himself examine. He thought back over the past few years, the small moments where their relationship had thinned without either of them naming it. Missed calls, short visits, conversations that stayed safely on the surface. He wondered how much of that damage came from Brian's influence, and how much came from his own decision to endure quietly rather than speak up. Whatever the reason, the closeness he once shared with his daughter now felt fragile, like glass already cracked. Brian, meanwhile, showed no signs of slowing down. Each day brought a new escalation. Another pointed comment passed through relatives, another version of events framed to make Hank look cruel and unstable. Hank felt boxed in, forced to either defend himself publicly or absorb the blows in silence. Neither option felt like a victory. Late one afternoon, Maggie found him sitting at the kitchen table, Emily's messages still glowing on his phone. "She keeps reaching out," Maggie said gently. "That means something." "It means she's torn," Hank replied, "and every word from him is pulling her further away." Maggie sat across from him. "Then maybe it's time to soften your stance." Hank looked up, surprised. "You think I should back down?" "I think," she said carefully, "that holding the line doesn't have to mean hardening your heart." Hank leaned back, rubbing his temples. He felt split down the middle, between the pride that had finally allowed him to stand up and the fear that this stand might cost him his daughter's future. "If I bend now," he said, "Brian wins. He learns that all he has to do is apply pressure." Maggie didn't argue right away. When she spoke again, her voice carried exhaustion. "I'm starting to wonder if this fight is changing us," she said. "I barely recognize our life anymore." That cut deeper than any insult Brian had thrown. Hank looked at her, really looked at the strain around her eyes, the way her shoulders sagged. He wanted to protect his family. Now he wasn't sure where the protection ended and the damage began. That night Hank lay awake thinking about forgiveness. The word it's. Elf felt premature, almost offensive. Forgiving Brian felt impossible. Forgiving the silence that had allowed everything to reach this point felt even harder. But forgiving Emily, his daughter, was different. He knew she hadn't intended this. She was trying to survive in the middle of something bigger than herself. Still, the hurt was too fresh. The image of her not defending him, of her choosing distance over confrontation, lingered like a bruise that hadn't faded yet. Maggie sat beside him on the bed. "Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting," she said quietly. "It just means leaving a door unlocked." Hank stared at the ceiling. What if opening that door lets more damage in? "Then you close it again," Maggie replied. "But if you don't open it at all, nothing heals." The next morning, Hank finally typed a response to Emily. It wasn't long, it wasn't warm, but it was honest. "I hear you, I need time, this hurts more than you know." He didn't press send right away. His finger hovered over the screen as doubt crept back in. Was this weakness, or the beginning of something necessary? Outside, his phone buzzed again. Another message, another update, another reminder that Brian wasn't finished. Hank knew reconciliation, if it came at all, wouldn't be quick or clean. But as he finally sent the message to his daughter, he understood one thing clearly. Standing firm didn't mean standing alone forever. The question was whether this small step toward forgiveness would bring healing, or invite the next wave of conflict crashing through the door. Brian's campaign didn't stay confined to family for long. Hank began to hear about it secondhand: friends who stopped calling, neighbors who suddenly avoided eye contact. Brian was reaching outward now, pulling in coworkers, old college friends, anyone willing to listen. He framed the story carefully, presenting himself as the reasonable one forced into a corner by an unstable, vindictive father-in-law. Hank could almost hear the tone in Brian's voice. Calm, persuasive, just wounded enough to sound believable. It worked. Invitations dried up. Texts went unanswered. A few people Hank trusted reached out, not to ask how he was, but to gently suggest he let things go for the sake of peace. Each conversation left him feeling smaller, more isolated. The circle he'd spent decades building was quietly shrinking, and there was nothing subtle about the reason why. Maggie called one afternoon while Hank was in the garage, staring at nothing. "I just got off the phone with Hannah," she said. "She's overwhelmed." Hank closed his eyes. "I figured." "She's caught in the middle, Hank," Maggie continued. "And it's tearing her apart. We have to think long-term here. Birthdays, holidays, grandkids someday. Is this how we want things to be?" Her words hit where Brian's attacks couldn't. Hank leaned against the workbench, feeling the weight of them settle in. "I am thinking long-term," he said. "I'm thinking about what it teaches him if I fold now." "I'm not asking you to fold," Maggie said. "I'm asking you to consider the cost." After the call ended, Hank sat alone, the quiet ringing in his ears. He thought of Hannah as a little girl, waiting by the window for him to come home from work. He thought of the pride in her eyes when she'd introduced Brian years ago, hopeful and certain. Now that certainty was gone, replaced by stress and divided loyalties, and Hank knew his choices played a role in that. Still, when the invitation came for a large family gathering, Hank didn't hesitate for long. He stared at the message, already imagining Brian holding court, turning every smile into a provocation. He typed a brief response and set his phone down. "I'm not going," he said aloud to the empty room. Maggie went without him. So did Hannah. Hank stayed home, the house unusually still, each hour stretching longer than the last. He wondered what was being said in his absence, what version of him was being passed around the table. The thought made his chest tighten, but he didn't regret his decision. Showing up would have meant pretending everything was fine, and nothing was. That night, Brian made sure Hank knew exactly what he'd missed. The post went up just before midnight. A long message, polished and deliberate, talking about toxic behavior and the heartbreak of being attacked by someone you once respected. Brian never used Hank's name. He didn't need to. The comments filled in the blanks quickly, some supportive, others openly hostile. Maggie called, her voice strained. "This is getting out of hand," she said. "People are angry." "So is he," Hank replied. "He's making you the villain," she said. Hank let out a slow breath. He's been doing that for years. Now he's just saying it out loud. After the call, Hank sat in the dark living room, the glow of his phone the only light. This had stopped being about one insult, one dinner, even one eviction. It had become something else entirely, a contest of wills fueled by pride and resentment. Brian didn't want resolution. He wanted submission. And as Hank stared at the ceiling, listening to the house creak around him, he realized the truth he'd been avoiding. This was no longer just a family conflict. It was a personal vendetta. The question wasn't whether Brian would escalate again. It was how far he was willing to go next, and whether Hank would be ready when he did. The change in Hannah didn't come with a fight or an accusation. It came in silence. Hank noticed it in the way her messages grew shorter, careful, in the pauses before she answered his calls, in the way she no longer asked his opinion, even on small things. The respect he once felt from his daughter, easy, unquestioned, had eroded into something fragile and distant, and that loss hurt more than anything Brian had done. Brian, sensing momentum, pushed harder. At the next extended family video call, Brian made sure Hank was included. He smiled too much, laughed too loudly, and framed every comment as concern. "We just want what's best for everyone," he said, shaking his head sadly. "I hate seeing people hold on to anger at their age." A few relatives shifted uncomfortably. Others nodded. Hank sat there, listening as Brian turned him into a caricature, stubborn, outdated, unable to adapt. Hank felt heat rise in his chest, but he didn't interrupt. He didn't need to. Brian's performance was growing too obvious. Maggie watched from beside Hank, her hands clenched together. When the call finally ended, she broke. "I can't do this anymore," she said, her voice cracking. "I can't keep pretending I can fix everyone." She sank onto the couch, tears spilling freely now. "I've tried to hold us together, Hank. I've defended you. I've defended him, and it's tearing me apart." Hank sat beside her, guilt pressing down hard. "I never meant for you to be in the middle." "But I am," she said, "and so is Hannah." For the first time, Hank allowed himself to imagine what it would look like to stop, to call Brian, to say whatever words would make this end. He pictured holidays without tension, his daughter's relief, Maggie's exhaustion lifting. The image didn't bring peace. It brought something closer to shame. "If I back down now," Hank said quietly, "I teach him that this works, that all he has to do is humiliate me publicly, and I'll disappear." Maggie looked at him, searching. What if standing your ground costs you your daughter? The question hung between them, heavy and terrifying. Hank didn't answer right away. He thought of Hannah as she was now caught, stressed, pulled in two directions. He thought of the man Brian was showing himself to be, not just to Hank but to the entire family. "I might have crossed a line," Hank said finally. "Serving those papers, doing it the way I did." Maggie nodded slowly. "Thank you for saying that." "But I won't apologize for refusing to be disrespected," Hank continued. "Not anymore." Over the next few days, the shift became impossible to ignore. Brian's constant needling began to grate on people. A cousin called Hank privately, admitting the stories didn't add up. An aunt declined to take Brian's side outright, saying, "There's more to this than he's telling." Brian noticed too. His messages grew sharper, his tone less controlled. Each attempt to dominate the narrative only highlighted his desperation. One evening, Maggie joined Hank on the back porch. The air was cold, the sky heavy with clouds. "They're starting to see it," she said quietly. "I wish it didn't have to be this way," Hank replied. "So do I," she said, "but I don't think you're wrong for fighting back." Hank nodded, resolve settling in. He knew reconciliation might come someday. He also knew it couldn't come at the cost of his self-respect. Whatever Brian threw at him next, Hank wasn't stepping aside. Not this time. And as the family lines continued to shift, Hank understood something with absolute clarity. This was the final stand, not just against Brian, but against the version of himself that had endured disrespect for far too long. Emily didn't call ahead, she just showed up. Hank heard the knock in the late afternoon, sharp and hesitant, and something in his chest tightened before he even reached the door. When he opened it, Emily stood there with her coat still on, eyes red, jaw set like she was holding herself together by force. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "I need to talk to you," she said. Hank stepped aside without a word. They sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the same one where Hank had spent so many nights staring at his phone, wondering if he'd lost her. Emily folded her hands, then unfolded them again, struggling to begin. "I'm disappointed in you," she said finally, her voice trembling. "What you did, serving him papers like that, it hurt people. It hurt me." Hank nodded, absorbing it. "I know." She looked up sharply, as if she'd expected an argument. Instead, she found him quiet, tired. Her resolve wavered. "You didn't even try to talk to me first," she continued. "You made a choice that forced everyone else to react." "I didn't think you'd hear me," Hank said gently. "Not with everything going on." Emily's breath hitched. Tears welled despite her effort to stop them. "You don't understand what it's been like," she said. "Living with him, managing his moods, making excuses so things don't explode." Hank leaned forward slightly. "Then help me understand." She wiped at her cheeks, the words spilling out now. "Brian's been controlling for years, not always obvious, not at first. He makes everything sound reasonable, like I'm overreacting, like I owe him loyalty because he protects me." Hank felt the room tilt. "Emily, why didn't you tell me?" "Because I was trying to protect everyone," she said through tears. "You, Mom, even him. I kept telling myself if I stayed quiet, if I smoothed things over, it would get better." The weight of it hit Hank all at once. All those moments of silence. All those holidays where something felt wrong but never surfaced. Brian's influence hadn't just been aimed at him. It had wrapped itself around his daughter's life. "I didn't choose him because he was right," Emily said softly. "I chose him because I was scared of what would happen if I didn't." Hank sat back stunned. "I thought you turned against me." Emily shook her head quickly. "No, I pulled away because it was the only way to survive." They sat there, the truth settling between them. Hank felt a surge of emotions collide: anger at Brian, guilt for not seeing this sooner, grief for the years Emily had carried this alone. "I kept telling myself you were strong," Hank said, "that you didn't need me stepping in." Emily laughed bitterly. "I needed you. I just didn't know how to ask without everything blowing up." She took a shaky breath, then straightened, resolve replacing fear. "But I can't keep doing this. I can't keep defending him. What he said to you, the way he treated you, it was wrong." Hank's throat tightened. "I'm done supporting that," Emily continued, "even if it costs me my marriage." The words landed heavy, final. She looked at him, then really looked, and her voice softened. "I'm sorry, Dad, for letting it go on, for not standing up sooner." Hank stood and crossed the room before he could think better of it. He pulled her into his arms, holding her like he used to when she was small. She broke against him, years of fear and restraint finally giving way. "I was so afraid I'd lost you," Hank said quietly. "You didn't," Emily replied. "I just didn't know how to find my way back." They stayed like that for a long moment, the past colliding with the present, something new beginning to form in the space between them. When Emily finally pulled back, Her eyes were clearer, steadier. "I don't know what happens next," she said, "but I can't pretend anymore." Hank nodded. "Whatever comes, we face it honestly." As Emily gathered her things to leave, Hank felt something shift inside him. Not relief, not victory, but possibility. The loyalty he'd feared losing had never fully disappeared. It had been buried under fear and manipulation. And as the door closed behind her, Hank understood this wasn't the end of the fight. It was the beginning of a different one where his daughter was finally standing beside him. The shift was immediate, and everyone felt it. Emily's visit didn't just change her relationship with Hank, it sent shockwaves through the entire family. Maggie moved through the house with a cautious relief, as if afraid that any sudden joy might shatter what little stability had returned. She smiled more, slept better, but the fear lingered behind her eyes. "I'm glad she stood with you," she told Hank one morning. "I just don't know if we can ever go back to what we were." Hank understood that better than anyone. Brian's reaction was exactly as Hank had feared. The moment Emily refused to echo his version of events, his anger erupted. Phone calls went unanswered. Texts grew longer, sharper, more desperate. When Emily finally confronted him in person, Hank wasn't there. But he didn't need to be to imagine it. Brian paced, Brian shouted, Brian demanded loyalty. "You're choosing him over me," Brian yelled, his voice cracking. "After everything I've done for you." Emily stood her ground. "I'm choosing myself," she said, "and I won't defend what you've done anymore." That refusal broke something in him. Brian's fury collapsed into something uglier, panic. He accused her of betrayal, of being manipulated, of ruining their future. When she didn't back down, he stormed out, slamming doors and threatening consequences he couldn't fully articulate. When Emily came to Hank afterward, she looked smaller somehow, worn thin by the effort it took to stand up. They sat together in silence before she spoke. "I don't know how to face him alone," she admitted. "I might need your help." Hank felt the familiar conflict twist in his chest. He wanted to protect her, to step in and shield her from the fallout. But he also knew that every move now risked pushing the family further apart. "I'll support you," he said carefully, "but this has to be your fight too." She nodded, grateful but overwhelmed. Despite the validation of Emily's support, Hank couldn't shake the guilt that followed him. He saw how deeply this conflict had shaken her, how tired she looked, how guarded. Standing up for him had cost her something, and that truth weighed heavily on him. "I thought I was doing the right thing," Hank told Maggie later that night. "But now I see how much it hurt her." "You didn't create this," Maggie said softly. "You exposed it." "That doesn't make it easier," Hank replied. The family existed now in fragments. Maggie tried to hold conversations that didn't circle back to Brian. Emily moved between resolve and exhaustion. Hank found himself measuring every word, every action, aware that even good intentions could deepen the divide. He also knew something else, something he didn't say out loud. This reconciliation with Emily might never be complete. Trust once strained didn't snap back easily. The years of silence, the distance, the manipulation, all of it had left marks. One evening, as Emily prepared to leave, she paused at the door. "I'm glad you didn't give up on me," she said. Hank forced a small smile. "I never could." After she left, Hank stood alone in the quiet house, feeling the weight of what lay ahead. Brian wasn't done. Emily was hurting. Maggie was bracing for more fallout. And Hank was left with the hardest truth of all. Even when you fight for what's right, the consequences don't disappear. They linger, reshaping everything you love in their wake. Rebuilding didn't happen all at once. It came in small, careful steps, like testing ice after a long winter. Emily began stopping by more often, sometimes with a purpose, sometimes just to sit at the kitchen table and talk about nothing important. Hank learned not to fill the silence, not to rush her into reassurance. They spoke honestly, sometimes awkwardly, about what had gone wrong between them. There were moments of laughter that surprised them both, followed by pauses where the weight of the past pressed back in. Maggie watched from a distance, careful not to interfere. She noticed the way Emily lingered longer with each visit, the way Hank's shoulders seemed less tense afterward. It gave her hope, but it was cautious hope. She'd been holding the family together for too long to believe healing came easily. At night, Hank replayed old decisions in his mind. He wondered how much of the damage could have been avoided if he'd spoken up sooner or differently. Pride had kept him silent for years, then pushed him into action all at once. He questioned whether either extreme had truly served his family. Meanwhile, Brian's influence continued to fade. His messages to Emily grew erratic, apologies followed by accusations, promises followed by threats. Each attempt to pull her back only confirmed what she already knew. When she refused to engage, he reached out to others, but fewer people answered now. His manipulation was losing its grip. "I still love him," Emily admitted to Hank one afternoon, "but I can't let that love excuse everything." Hank nodded. "Love shouldn't feel like fear." She met his eyes then. "What we have is damaged," she said, "but I don't want to lose you too." The honesty of it struck him hard. "I don't want that either," Hank replied. "I just don't always know how to fix what I've broken." Emily's voice softened. "Then let's try together." That was the moment Hank realized redemption wasn't about being right. It was about being present. He agreed to take things slowly, to listen more than he spoke, to let Emily set the pace. It didn't come naturally, but he was learning. Maggie finally spoke her fears aloud one evening after Emily left. "I'm afraid to hope," she said. "I don't want to watch this fall apart again." "I know," Hank said, "but doing nothing isn't an option anymore." She studied his face, then nodded. "I see something different in you," she admitted. "Less stubborn, more open." Hank smiled faintly. "Don't get used to it." Despite the progress, uncertainty lingered. Brian hadn't disappeared. He was quieter now, but that silence felt deliberate. Hank sensed it every time Emily flinched at her phone, every time Maggie hesitated before making plans. Still, something real was forming again between father and daughter. Fragile, unfinished, but real. As Hank watched Emily walk down the driveway after another quiet visit, he felt a cautious optimism take hold. The road ahead was long, and mistakes were inevitable. But for the first time in a long while, he believed redemption wasn't just possible, it was worth fighting for. And somewhere in that fragile peace, Hank sensed that the hardest tests were still waiting just beyond the horizon. Brian's unraveling didn't come with a single explosion. It showed itself in fragments, late-night voicemails that swung between pleading and accusation, sudden appearances where he wasn't welcome, messages sent and deleted before anyone could respond. The control he once wielded so effortlessly was slipping, and the loss of it made him unpredictable. Where he had once sounded confident and composed, now there was desperation beneath every word. Maggie saw it before she wanted to admit it. For years, she had framed Brian's behavior as stress, ambition, personality clashes. Now, with distance, the pattern became impossible to ignore. The subtle isolations, the way he spoke for Emily, the pressure disguised as concern. Watching her daughter hesitate before answering her phone, Maggie felt a heavy guilt settle in her chest. "I didn't see it," she admitted one night, her voice shaking. "Or maybe I didn't want to." Hank didn't say "I told you so." He didn't need to. Instead, he spoke calmly, laying out moments Maggie had witnessed herself, things she'd brushed past to keep the peace. He wasn't trying to convince her anymore. He was helping her see. And slowly she did. Hank found himself stepping into a role he'd avoided for years. He took the lead in conversations, not with anger but with clarity. When family discussions turned tense, he redirected them toward facts, patterns, consequences. He didn't attack Brian, he described behavior. The difference mattered. Maggie listened. Emily listened more closely than ever. Emily, for her part, began to change in ways that startled even herself. She stopped explaining Brian's actions. She corrected him when he twisted her words. The first time she said no, without apologizing afterward, her hands shook, but she didn't back down. "I'm allowed to decide things for myself," she said aloud one evening, as if testing the sentence for truth. Hank nodded, pride and worry colliding in his chest. "You always were." They agreed to see a family counselor together, not as a grand solution, but as a place to speak freely without the noise of the past crowding in. The office was quiet, neutral, intentionally unremarkable. Emily sat with her shoulders tense at first, words coming slowly. Hank listened more than he spoke, forcing himself to stay open even when it hurt. "I've been terrified of losing everyone," Emily admitted, staring at the floor. "I thought if I made the wrong choice, I'd end up alone." "And now?" the counselor asked. Emily took a breath. "Now I realize staying silent was already costing me my family and myself." Hank felt something loosen inside him. He reached for her hand, hesitant, giving her time to pull away if she wanted. She didn't. Afterward, they walked out into the parking lot together, neither rushing to leave. "I don't know if this fixes everything," Emily said. "It doesn't have to," Hank replied. "It just has to be honest." Brian noticed the shift. His attempts to reassert control grew sharper, more transparent. When they failed, he lashed out at Maggie, at extended family, at anyone who wouldn't echo him. But the effect wasn't what he expected. People began to pull back. The tides were turning, quietly but decisively. Hank still carried scars. He still woke some nights replaying words he wished he'd said differently. But watching Emily stand taller, watching Maggie reclaim her own voice, he felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. Hope. It was cautious, fragile, but real. Their relationship wasn't healed, not yet. But for the first time since Christmas, Hank believed it might be. And as Brian's grip continued to weaken, Hank understood that the hardest part of this journey wasn't confronting an enemy. It was learning to trust that what was broken could still be rebuilt. Brian chose the stage carefully. He didn't knock on doors or send private messages this time. He went public. A long post appeared online late Sunday morning, tagged with family names, framed as a final appeal. He wrote about loyalty, about being betrayed by people he'd given everything to. He talked about manipulation, painted himself as the last honest voice in a family that had turned against him. It was polished, emotional, and designed to force a response. It got one. By evening, the family had gathered, some in person, others on video, drawn in by the spectacle Brian had created. He stood at the center of the living room, shoulders squared, eyes bright with the kind of confidence that comes from believing the room still belongs to you. "I won't stay silent anymore," Brian said. "I've been painted as a villain, but the truth needs to come out." Emily rose from her seat before anyone could stop her. "No," she said, her voice steady. "I will." The room stilled. Brian turned toward her, surprise flashing across his face. "Emily, sit down. This is—" "It is," she interrupted, "and I'm done letting you control the story." Hank stood beside her without a word. He didn't need to speak. His presence said everything. Emily faced the room, her hands trembling only slightly. "For years, Brian has twisted situations to isolate me," she said. "He convinced me that standing up for myself meant betraying him. He convinced me that my family was the problem." Brian laughed sharply. "This is ridiculous." "Is it?" Emily shot back. "You told me my father was unstable. You told me my mother didn't understand us. You told me loyalty meant silence." The murmurs started then. Uneasy glances passed between relatives. Brian's face reddened. "You're being manipulated," he snapped, pointing at Hank. "He's turned you against me." Hank finally spoke. "No," he said calmly, "you did that yourself." Brian stepped forward, his composure cracking. "After everything I did for this family." Emily didn't flinch. "What you did was control us, and I let it happen because I was afraid." Her voice broke, but she didn't stop. "I'm not afraid anymore." The room felt charged now, tension buzzing under every breath. Brian's hands curled into fists. "So that's it," he shouted. "You all believe this?" No one answered him. That silence broke him. He lashed out, words spilling without restraint, accusations, insults, fragments of grievances he'd kept buried. The mask slipped completely. The calm, reasonable man he'd presented to the world disappeared, replaced by anger raw and unfiltered. Emily stepped back, shaken but resolute. Maggie moved to her side, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. In that moment, mother and daughter saw the truth together, how much of their fear, their tensio, had grown from Brian's manipulation. "This ends now," Maggie said quietly. Brian looked around the room, searching for support that wasn't there. Even those who had defended him before avoided his gaze. One by one, they disengaged, leaving him standing alone in the wreckage of his own words. He grabbed his coat and stormed out, the door slamming behind him with finality. The silence that followed felt different, not heavy, clear. Hank exhaled slowly, a deep satisfaction settling in his chest. Not triumph, but vindication. The pain, the doubt, the long nights questioning himself, it hadn't been for nothing. Standing his ground had exposed the truth. Emily turned to him, her eyes filled with something new, respect. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for not giving up on me." Hank swallowed. "Thank you for finding your voice." They stood together, no longer divided by fear or misunderstanding. What lay ahead was uncertain, but it was theirs to face, honestly, together. As the family began to disperse, Hank knew one chapter had ended. And while healing would take time, the future no longer belonged to Brian's control. Healing didn't arrive with relief or celebration. It arrived quietly, in routines that felt unfamiliar at first. Hank started therapy on a cold Monday morning, sitting in a small office that smelled faintly of coffee and old books. He hadn't planned on talking much. Decades of swallowing frustration had taught him how to endure, not explain. But once he began, the words came faster than he expected, memories of being dismissed, the slow erosion of his place in the family. The moment he realized silence had cost him more than confrontation ever could. Saying it out loud didn't fix anything immediately, but it loosened something inside him. Emily noticed the change before he did. He listened more. He didn't retreat when conversations got uncomfortable. When she doubted herself, he didn't rush to solve the problem. He stayed present. That alone made her feel steadier. With her father's support, Emily began reclaiming pieces of herself she'd set aside for years. She spoke more confidently at work. She stopped apologizing for setting boundaries. When Brian tried to contact her again, she didn't respond, not out of fear but choice. Each decision strengthened her sense of self-worth. Maggie watched it all with mixed emotions. Relief, yes, but also guilt. In the quiet moments, she recognized how often she'd smoothed things over, how her desire for peace had allowed manipulation to go unchecked. She carried that realization heavily, but instead of turning away from it, she faced it. "I thought keeping everyone calm meant keeping us safe," she admitted one evening. "I see now it just kept us stuck." Hank didn't blame her. He understood how easy it was to confuse endurance with love. Brian, meanwhile, existed on the edges now. No invitations, no calls returned. His absence was noticeable but necessary. Without his constant presence, the family breathed easier. The tension that once filled every gathering was gone, replaced by cautious quiet. Hank felt himself changing too. Therapy didn't erase the scars, but it gave him tools to understand them. He began to trust his instincts again, to believe that asserting his worth didn't make him cruel or selfish. Each small breakthrough rebuilt confidence he hadn't realized he'd lost. One afternoon, Emily sat with him on the porch, the air warm and still. "I should have spoken up sooner," she said softly. "I let fear make choices for me. Hank shook his head. You did what you could with what you had. She smiled faintly. Thank you for standing by me when I finally did. He met her gaze. That's what fathers are supposed to do. They sat in silence, comfortable now. The pain hadn't vanished, but it no longer defined them. I know we're not fixed, Emily said. Not completely. We don't have to be, Hank replied. We just have to keep moving forward. As the sun dipped lower, Hank felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, peace, tentative but real. Healing was happening slowly, unevenly, but honestly. And while the road ahead remained long, Hank knew they were finally walking it together. Dinner was simple, no holiday decorations, no forced cheer, just the quiet clink of plates and the steady hum of the house settling around them. Hank sat across from Emily at the table, the same place where so many hard conversations had unfolded. Tonight felt different, not light exactly, but calm in a way that didn't demand performance. They talked about the journey without rushing it, the mistakes, the misunderstandings, the moments where both of them had almost given up. Emily spoke openly now, without the careful editing she'd learned to use for years. Hank listened, resisting the old urge to interrupt or fix. I didn't realize how small I'd made myself, Emily admitted. I thought that was what love looked like. Hank nodded. Sometimes we confuse survival with compromise. Despite everything, he felt a glimmer of hope take hold. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was steady, the kind that grows when you stop lying to yourself. Maggie joined them partway through the meal, sitting quietly, watching the two of them talk. She still carried caution in her expression, but there was relief there too. You both seem lighter, she said. We're trying, Emily replied with a faint smile. Later, Emily took a breath and said something that surprised them both. I'm going to start therapy. Hank looked up. For you? She nodded. I need to understand why I stayed quiet for so long. I don't want to repeat it. Hank felt pride stir, tempered with humility. That's a good choice, he said, and it's yours. When he offered advice now, it came carefully. Less instruction, more presence. You don't owe anyone explanations for protecting yourself, he said. Just make sure you're being honest with yourself. Emily smiled. I learned that from you. The evening ended without ceremony. No declarations, just shared space. As Hank cleaned the dishes, he felt the weight of forgiveness settle in, not toward Brian, not yet, but toward himself. He'd made mistakes. He'd waited too long, but he'd also stood up when it mattered. The family wasn't whole again, not completely, but it was healing. And for the first time in a long while, Hank believed that was enough. The house was quiet when Emily found Hank on the back porch. Evening light stretched across the yard, soft and forgiving. She sat beside him without a word, letting the silence do its work before she spoke. Thank you, she said finally, for standing up for me, even when I couldn't. Hank didn't answer right away. He looked out at the trees, remembering how close he'd come to losing her, how heavy that fear had been. I wish I'd done it sooner, he said. You did it when it mattered, Emily replied. He turned toward her then, seeing a strength in her that hadn't been there before, or maybe had always been there, waiting. The journey they'd taken together had been painful, but it had forged something deeper than what they'd lost. Their bond hadn't just survived, it had evolved. Later that evening, the family gathered for a holiday dinner, smaller than years past, quieter too. There was no pretense that everything was perfect. Instead, there was honesty. Laughter came in brief bursts, not forced but real. Progress was acknowledged in small ways, a shared glance, a moment of understanding. Maggie caught Hank's eye from across the table and smiled. It wasn't the easy smile of before, but it held something steadier. They'd begun talking again, really talking about trust, about the years they'd both spent avoiding conflict. Rebuilding wasn't quick, but it was intentional. Emily moved through the evening with confidence. She spoke about plans she hadn't shared before, ideas, ambitions, the shape of a life she was beginning to imagine without fear. Free from Brian's shadow, she seemed lighter, more present. As the night wound down, Hank felt a quiet resolve settle over him. He couldn't change the past. He couldn't undo the pain, but he could choose not to carry it forward. "I'm done letting it define us," he said to Maggie later, as they stood in the kitchen together. She nodded, "Me too." When Emily left that night, she hugged Hank tightly. "I'm going to be okay," she said. "I know," Hank replied. Alone again, Hank stood in the living room taking in the warmth of the evening that had been. The family was scarred, yes, but those scars told a story of survival, not defeat. For the first time since Christmas, Hank felt something like peace. Hank and Emily walked side by side down the quiet street, their breath visible in the cool air. The neighborhood was calm, trees bare, sidewalks familiar in a way that felt earned rather than taken for granted. This was a walk they'd taken countless times when she was younger, back when problems could be solved with reassurance and scraped knees healed quickly. Now, the silence between them carried weight, but not discomfort. "We've both learned some hard lessons," Emily said finally. Hank nodded. "Hard lessons tend to stick." They walked a little farther before he spoke again. "I used to think forgiveness meant pretending things didn't hurt," he said. "It doesn't. Forgiveness isn't easy, but it's the only way to heal." Emily absorbed that quietly. "I'm still figuring out what forgiveness looks like for me," she admitted, "but I know what I won't accept anymore." Hank smiled faintly. That confidence earned, not borrowed, meant more to him than any apology ever could. Back at the house, Maggie was waiting with coffee already poured. The three of them sat together not to solve anything, not to revisit old wounds, but simply to exist in the same space. There was peace in that simplicity. They knew challenges would come. Healing wasn't linear, but they also knew they wouldn't face it alone. Emily spoke about her plans, work, therapy, the independence she was building piece by piece. There was no hesitation in her voice now, no need for approval. "I'm proud of you," Hank said. She met his eyes. "I learned strength from you, even when it was messy." That honesty closed something inside him. For months, he'd carried doubt about his choices, his timing, the damage left in his wake. Now, watching Emily stand firmly in herself, Hank felt a sense of closure settle in. Not because everything was perfect, but because the truth had finally surfaced. Later that evening, laughter drifted through the house. Small moments, a shared joke, a familiar song playing softly, filled the rooms with warmth. These weren't celebrations of victory. They were acknowledgments of survival. Hank leaned back in his chair, taking it in. The family had endured the darkest version of themselves and emerged altered but intact, scarred but wiser. As night fell, Emily stood to leave. She paused at the door, then turned back. "I'm ready," she said simply. "For what?" Hank asked. "For my life." He watched her walk down the steps, confident and unburdened. And in that moment, Hank felt peace, not the absence of pain, but the presence of meaning. The past no longer demanded his attention. The future no longer frightened him. Hank and Emily walked into the future, their bond stronger than ever, a testament to the power of forgiveness and love.